Hey, welcome back guys. This will be episode number 1 of the handle material playlist. I've been really excited about this one, guys. So basically each episode I'm going to go over a new type of handle material. I've got 50 to 100 different types of materials I'm going to showcase in this playlist right here. So if you're looking at using a new piece of handle material, reference this playlist and see if I've got it. If I do already, I'll show you how I'm going to cut it, sand it, buff it, all the different things that I learned about using each different type of material. In this first video, I'm going to use a hybrid blank. This particular blank was donated by Bradley over at Strange Materials. He's a really awesome guy. He's a great vendor. He's never disappointed me. All his materials are wonderful. In fact, at the end of the video, I'm going to kind of shoot an overview of some of the products that I get from him on a regular basis. And one of the coolest things is this Fordite right here. Yeah, I'm going to give you some close-ups of that. Super neat stuff. On this right here, let's jump right in and I'll show you how I work a hybrid blank. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my block of wood and I'm going to decide how I want to orient this on the knife. Now, you can't see it very well because this is so rough right here, but see how the wood is here on this side, but it comes up on this side? That means there's a really cool passage in here of resin that you're going to be able to see through because this is kind of somewhat clear resin. So this is something that I really want to work into the knife. I want this part to be clear on the butt end of the knife so that I can see it. I don't want to put this on the tang of the knife because you would see the tang in the middle of it. So we don't want that, at least not on this knife. So my plan is to have the tang stop right there. So my pocket that will hold my tang will stop right here inside of the wood section. And then the handle will continue into this blue section. And when this is polished, it'll be clear. And it'll be a really cool transition from the burl wood into the clear hybrid. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go over, now that I've decided what I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and cut this out on the bandsaw and get this trimmed up and shaped the way that I want it in a block, and then I'll go over and I'll drill my hole to accept my tang. Here we go. The reason I didn't continue this cut all the way to the end is because this is still usable material that I might use for bolsters on knives or other things like that. So there's no reason to cut it off until I know how I'm going to use it. This was the piece that I needed, and now I need to cut off this front section so that I've got the right distance for my tang to sit in there. Okay, so I want to look at this. I want my tang to sit right there and not protrude out into this blue area. So I'm going to measure this distance up and cut a line right here. I'm going to leave a little bit of wiggle room so that after I'm done cutting this, I can shore it up and square it up on the grinders. I've gone ahead and put my work rest on here, and every now and then it's a good idea to go ahead and make sure that you're still running square to your belt. We're going to go ahead and take this. What my objective here is just to clean this up. I don't want to change the angle of it. I just want to clean it up. I've got a coarse grip belt on here because this burl will burn really fast if you use a higher grip belt. Do you notice how I drag the piece across the belt? I'm doing that because since this is not a brand new belt, there's always a possibility for different variations to be worn into a belt depending on whatever tasks you've used the belt for before. So it's a good idea to take your piece and pull it across the belt so that way you don't get any tracks or different artifacts left in your wood. You're going to get a much flatter grind. You know, it's almost as good as using the disc sander. This will never be as good as a disc sander, but if you don't have a disc sander, this will work just fine. You just have to take care to get a good cut. Okay, so what I want to check here, I've got this flat here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bump it up to my guard. And what I'm looking for is to make sure that my piece is oriented correctly to this guard. And what I mean by that is right now you can see that the handle material is canted up slightly. And we don't want that. That won't look good. We really want the handle material to be right about there for it to look good to the knife. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take this line here and trim some material off the bottom to change the angle of this, so when it butts up to this guard, we've got the right fitment. So this is now going to move to there. Now if you look closely, you can see right here how much of a gap that we have. That's roughly how much material we're going to have to take off the bottom in the reverse configuration to achieve this angle that we're going for here. I'm just going to eyeball this. Okay, let's see how we did. That's perfect. That's what we wanted. Now, this material on top of the knife will get cut off, but I like to glue it up so that I have just a little bit on the excess on the top so that I can cut it off. And on the bottom, everything that will be below this will get cut off. And then, I'm going to have a little bit of a hang down on the end. You can kind of see a rough pencil mark right there. That's going to be the end of the knife. But I left just a little bit of extra so that if I change my mind down the road, I can easily make a change. So this is going to come up just a little bit and then swoop down and come up. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to mark a center line. I'll put this up here. I'll mark where my tang is going to be on both the top and the bottom. And then I'll transfer those lines to up here so I know how large of a pocket I need to drill. I will take a depth measurement of my tang to here. I will set a drill bit in my mill to drill this deep. I'll put it in my mill and I'm going to go ahead and drill out some holes so that I can set this tang into here. Let's go over and do that next. Okay. That's my center line. Just going to darken it up here a little bit here, just so I can see it real nice. I'm going to move it over to the mill. Alright, now lay this on here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to trace around this. I know where it's going to be, and I'm going to transfer this right up over the top. Transfer this one right up over the top. Now I'm going to select a drill bit just slightly larger than the tang, chalk it up, and I'll see you over at the mill. Alright, let me bring you guys in close here and show you what I'm doing. Alright, so here's my piece. Let me go ahead and move the table this direction so you can see that when I drop the drill bit, see how I've lined the drill bit right up with this side of the tang. I do that by lowering this, I loosen this, move this block around until it lines up perfect, I lock it down here, and then I remove this out of the way. Okay, I move that back up, and then I bring the table back to where my drill bit is now on my center line. Lock it in place. You could do this on a drill press too, and then you just drill it out. Remove a little bit of material at a time. Okay, so let's see how we did. Perfect. That's perfect. There's just a little bit of wiggle room, which is good because you need a little bit of room for your epoxy in there. Other than that, check that out. Perfect fitment, perfect fitment. We got the angle right. Everything's good. So now let's mark the pin placement, drill it, and then we'll glue this bad boy up. Marking the pin placement is very simple. What I like to do is I drill a little bit larger hole than the pin stock that I'm going to use. I line that up with my lines there. I draw where that hole is. And then I'm going to go and drill a hole for my pin smaller than this, the size of the pin that I'm going to use, right in the middle. That gives me a little bit of wiggle room with the tang when I put this in for glue up. And then the area around this pin will fill up with a resin, or with my epoxy. Here I am. I'm at the point of glue up, guys. I've got my blade exactly where I want it. It's done. I've got my guard fit. I've made sure I don't have any gaps. I've finished the top of the guard. So the top of the guard and the blade are finished. You don't need any fancy jigs or anything to do these. This is actually pretty simplistic. What I like to do is just put a piece of leather on here, put it in my vise to protect the knife. This is a vise that I use specifically for gluing up knives. Whoop, yikes. Try not to scratch anything. There we go. Everything's harder when you're doing it on camera, by the way. So you just get it nice and tight in there. Okay. Alright. We have verified that this fits and there's no gaps and that the pin will go through. That's all you need to do, okay? I have all my stuff laid out. So when I get this glued up, I will be putting this on here just like so, and then I'll give it a good clamp and I'll make sure everything's straight. That's what holds the handle material up against the guard and keeps it nice and tight. So for this process, I like to put my aluminum foil right here underneath the knife so that when I squeeze it all together, it drips right here on my aluminum foil. Just make myself a pile of A and B part epoxy. And proceed to mix it thoroughly. The biggest mistake with epoxy is not mixing it thoroughly. You have to get it fully mixed or else it will not set properly. The other thing that I like to do is after I glue these up, I will leave the unused epoxy right here so that when I come out in 24 hours, I can test the unused epoxy and see how well it's set up. And that gives me an idea of how well it's set up on the inside of the knife. You know, if I come out and that epoxy's real gummy and didn't set up, well, then I know it didn't set up on the inside of the knife too. I use a 5-minute set epoxy. Works just fine. You can pick it up at Lowe's, Home Depot, anything like that. This is JB Weld brand. I've used the Loctite brand. It works just fine too. This has an extremely high holding power and it's a very, very good epoxy. Alright, so this is mixed thoroughly right here. Let's go ahead and fill the handle. I found that drizzling it works the best because it actually allows room for air to escape the hole in the handle. And just take your time with it. I really get a lot of enjoyment out of knife making, guys. I mean, this really is one of my favorite things to do. Earlier in my life, I spent a lot of time making things and fabricating things. And I realized early that I do love doing this kind of stuff. I never really saw myself as being a knife maker when I was young, but that's just something that I kind of worked into, you know, and now I love it. It's a passion. All right. It's gone ahead and it's squeezed out the holes. I've got the main portion of the knife filled. which is good. Just throw some more in there. I'm gonna have lots of squeeze out, excess, that's good. Make sure we've got everything oriented correctly, and on we go. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get epoxy all over our pen. Pen is installed. Get a good clamp here. Now again, make sure that everything's oriented correctly, right where you want it. Right there. Things nice and tight. We're nice and even. Make sure everything's straight and lined this way. Make sure everything's straight this way. Everything looks good. Everything's lined up. We can tap the pen back and forth just a little bit so make sure that that resin really gets in there. And now we're going to address the little tiny bit of squeeze out that happened up around the guard, which is very little. I have a little tiny spot where a little tiny bit of epoxy squeezed out right here on this side. Let me just get that out of there. Oh, we have one little tiny dot. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. Alright, yeah, you can see it. A little tiny spot of epoxy showed up right there. So that's what you want to really make sure that you get out of there. So I just take a folded piece of paper towel. I know there's a lot of different ways to do this. Some guys use Q-tips. You know, I found out Q-tips leave a lot of little boogers and stuff that I just as soon not deal with. There we go. Clean. After everything's clean, I go back with one more piece with a little bit of acetone on it, and just make sure that all my metal flats are clean. Just like that. Because once this stuff dries, it does not like to come off. So just make sure that everything's the way that you want it. Nothing's showing up anywhere. Make sure the top of your guard's cleaned off too, because you can't change it once it's done. Especially when you do a satin finish. That's done, guys. Tomorrow night we'll get to come back and shape it, and we'll have a really cool hybrid handle. Okay, so first things first, check this, make sure that our epoxy set up, and it did. It's real nice and super hard. The epoxy's done, it's good. Excellent news. That means that we're good. We can take this all apart now. Perfect. Let's move on to handle shaping the new hybrid handle blank. Alright. Before we clean up this side, we want to make sure that we still have our mark for our tang. That way when we draw the profile of our knife handle, we know for a fact that we're not going to get into the pocket that we drilled for the tang. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line that corresponds to this top line on the knife right here. We're just going to carry that line right through to the handle material. Okay? This top piece right here will get ground off. Then next thing we're going to do is draw another line. This part right here where we have this dip right here, that's where we want the guard to also come into the knife handle, right there. So that's where we're at right there. So what I like to do is draw a parallel line off the back of the knife to the front of the knife to give me a reference of what's straight. Okay? Now that gives me, if this line's here, this line is parallel to this line, so this section will be the same thickness. That doesn't mean that I'm going to run at that thickness, because obviously we've got some drop in the handle back here, which I like. So we're going to bring this back, we're going to bring this back here, just this natural drop, because a little bit of this material needs to come off to true it up. So we're just going to take that into consideration here. And down here on the bottom, now this is straight to the back. What I think we're going to do, if this comes in to right there, what we're going to do is we're going to come out a couple finger spaces and give it kind of a little bit of a feature right there in the middle. That's money right there. Alright, I'm not really too worried about using a fresh belt quite yet, because this is still hogging material off here. What we've got here is the first tip. On the sander, when you're moving from the wood into this resin section, the resin grinds much faster than the wood does. So you'll notice it drops off when it hits this resin. So that's a place that you're going to have to be really careful to not get any washouts. So I'm going to focus on the wood area only, and then I'll feather it into my resined area. What I'm going to do now that I've got this basic profile done on the handle, now what I'll do is I will slowly peck away at removing this material on this 2x72 without overheating this guard material right there. That's what you don't want to do, is overheat it, because you'll affect your glue right here, and you don't want to melt your glue. So just take your time at it. You could cut some of this out beforehand. That works for some people. I find it sometimes it causes me grief, so I like to just leave it a solid block, and then I shape it after my glue up. Now you'll also notice this side of the handle is not cut to shape yet. So this side is already smooth and square to the blade. This side has extra material on it. I squared this side of the handle material first so that I could do this profile, and that will make this line 90 degrees to my squared side that's already squared up to the knife. So that way, this is perfect. I haven't ground off my lines yet. After I get my profile set and I get this done, then what I'll do is I will lay this on the table on a 1, 2, 3 block and scribe this out. And then I'll grind this side down so I have an even thickness for my handle to start with. So what I do here is I take my 1, 2, 3 block. This side's already flat, so I'm going to lay this side right here. This is my flat. And then what I'm going to do is take my height gauge and figure out what my low point is over here. Right there. Okay. Now that that's done, I could take this and I can run it right around my handle material. And this is going to give me a good idea of how much material I need to cut off to make it square. right there? A little bit of material all the way around. And when I go grind that off, my handle material will now be square. Here's our knife. We've got the basic profile done here. That's fine. Everything's pretty dialed in, and we've taken it up to a 220 finish around the outside and down here. And we've got a 220 finish on the sides, and you could kind of start seeing into this resin right here. I will tell you, when you feel this, you can noticeably feel a ridge right here that drops off when you hit the resin. That's telling me this resin is sanding much faster than the wood. Even on a flat belt, I'm getting a wash out there. So I'm definitely going to have to sand this with a hard block with no soft backing on the block to get this transition to be smooth. That's going to take some work. I'm going to have to work this area for a minute to get it to the right height and then transition it into this without washing it out when I get to here. It would be very easy shaping this to turn this into a turd. You know, if you just walked up to your belt grinder and think that you could just round this off and this and that, what's going to end up happening is you're just going to have this kind of rounded off glob, and that's not at all what we want. I'm thinking that this would look really cool with some flat facets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grind a flat off of this corner and this corner, a small flat, like a facet about that big, on both the tops. And I'm going to leave those facets there. I'm not going to round it over. So I'm going to sand a flat here, I'm going to sand a flat here and here, and I'm going to leave those. Now on the bottom of the knife, I'm going to come up a little higher to about here. And I'm going to draw myself a line here and draw a line here. I'm going to grind off a section there that'll give me a nice tall gradient rise up towards the center of the knife. And I probably will round the bottom of the knife just so it fits in your hand. But when it comes to the butt, it'll have the facets on the back. And I think I'm going to step the pommel out slightly and grind facets on the back of the knife also, so it looks kind of like a gemstone. I'll show you how I do all those things. First thing I'm going to do is give myself some layout lines. These are going to be my grind to lines for the facets on the top of the knife, and we'll grind those in first. These are going to be equal on the top and on the sides. So I didn't change my distance here. Give yourself a good line. I'm going to grind these with a 120 belt to try to keep the heat down. And then I'll finish up with the 220 before I move into hand sanding. So let's go. First thing I'm going to do is go grind these off on the grinder. One thing I do want to show you real quick here. You'll notice that I'm grinding this metal part first because the metal will grind the hardest. So I'll dwell here and I'll get my metal dialed in where I want it. Once I get the metal to the lines where I want it, I will start working this way. This grinds the second hardest and this grinds the easiest. So I'll start at the metal, I'll get it dialed in, and then I'll transition into this wood, and then I'll slowly pull it through the resin section. Alright, so that's the top facets that I was just talking about. Here and here, we ground those right into the guard material. And we'll see that here in the butt of the knife too. It's all nice and equal. And those will get hand sanded now from this point. I took them up to 220. Okay, so let's see here. I take the same measurement as the top down here on the bottom. But on the side, I'm going to take this much higher. And this will give me a nice steep angle right here. Now when I grind this off, I'll grind into this guard area too. And see how this is square right now? It's going to then be tapered. Okay, I've gone as far as I want to on the machines. For now, I'm going to take it over and start hand sanding. I've gone ahead and cut this in. Cut that in, and then I cut in this lower ledge. This lower ledge right here is the exact same as this line and this line. All I did was just connect these two lines with a slight sweep in there. This one right here, I'm going to connect into this line here, but I drew it to a taper slightly off of the center line to create this portion of the guard. Pretty neat. Got a lot of hand sanding to do. You know, as I ground into this section, my wood bridge disappeared, so now I have an island. Just super cool. This is my private island. So I'm going to go ahead and hand sand all these out, get this 100%, get the guard 100%, and when I'm done with everything, I'll sand this pommel, and then I'll go ahead and cut in my facets here at the very end. So I've got all my stuff set up here. I'm just going to come in and, you know, even things up all the way around with the 220. Once I get things kind of evened up and where I want them, I'll move on to my 500 and just kind of progress through my grits, trying to make sure that I keep everything flat and within the lines. One thing I've noticed here, guys, when I'm sanding this, it's good to sand the wood first, kind of dwell in this area, and then come down here and sand this. If you try to take long strokes over the whole thing, this loads up your sandpaper immediately and it gets real gummy. This is what your sandpaper looks in a matter of a couple strokes. So the problem is, if you load up your sandpaper and then drag it across the wood, you fill all these little pores in the wood with your resin dust, and it kind of gums up the wood. So I found it's easier. So first I worked on cleaning up the guard area, focusing right here, and then I transitioned into the wood and cleaned up my transition here, and I sanded all the way to here. Now I'm going to go ahead and take my new piece of paper here and start this area, and I'll sand this back here and get it where I want it to be, and then right at the end I'll feather it right into this wood area right here with fresh paper each time, so that this transition is real nice and smooth and I don't gum up all this wood here. I've taken this all the way up to 1200 grit, wet dry sandpaper, dry. I haven't used any water because I don't want to moisten the maple burl here. Now I'm going to draw some lines that I'm going to cut these facets into the handle to create my pommel. Alright, so what we're going to do to finish the knife from here, we've got this sanded out to 1200 grit, we've got our facets in here. This is pretty close. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to tape off the wood, tape off the blade, and I'm going to buff this guard. After I buff the guard, then I'll go ahead and buff my plastic or my resin to get it crystal clear. Then I'm going to infiltrate the wood with the tung oil. The handle should be done at that point. So I'm going to go ahead, tape this off and buff this guard. Then we're going to lightly buff this material. I don't want to buff this too hard because I don't want to change any of my hard lines that I have in there. And a lot of times when you're buffing plastic or resin, it's really easy to remove material on accident. So we definitely don't want to do that. I'm going to take extreme caution with the buffer. In fact, more likely than not, I'll do a lot of hand buffing with some buffing compound on this to really get it to go crystal clear. But right now, let's go over and get this cleaned up. This is arguably the hardest part of doing this knife handle that I've decided to do, is these little flat facets that I've decided to do on the end of the knife. You know, each one of these flats ends in a corresponding facet like a gemstone on the end of the knife. And in order to do that, you've got to have something super rigid and flat. And I'm going to try to get in frame here. And then you have to work each one of these perfectly flat, and don't change the angle that the facet is ground in, or else the points that line up won't line up anymore. So once you get it sanded completely out to your 1200 grit, you can polish it up. I tried to put this on the buffer and it did not work. Let's put some polish on it. Why not? Let's see what happens when we polish this up with some cut. Let's look at the tips and tricks that we've learned working with the hybrid material. I will say hybrid material on a rating of 1 to 10 was probably a difficulty level of a 5. This material was actually not really easy to work. I've worked with this before. I've never really worked with it in the sense of trying to make a video and think about how it would be difficult for other people. So working through this process, you know, I looked at my own trials and tribulations that I went through to finish it. And here's what I came up with. So a hybrid is a combination of wood and resin. You can have hardwoods, softwoods, burl woods, and resin. Different colored resins, but generally speaking, most of the resins on these hybrids are going to be aluminite resin, so it's basically going to be the same composition on most hybrids for the resin part. This part can differ. On this one, I had a maple burl. Maple burl is probably medium on the hardness scale when it comes to wood, so it's a rather soft wood. One of the things that I found the largest difficulty with this hybrid right here, even with the softwood, was that the resin sands away much more rapidly than the wood does. So the problem with that is, if you're not extremely careful on your mechanical sanding machines, the resin will just vaporize and it's gone before your wood is. So if you're trying to keep really crisp lines, I would suggest getting close on your mechanical sanders and then finishing it with files and hand sanding like I did in the video. What happens, even on your mechanical sander, say you've got a flat platen and you've got this pushed up against a flat platen, the belt takes away the resin faster than the wood. So what happens is you get this slight raised feeling at the transition point between the two materials. In an effort to strive for perfection, I wanted this to be as absolutely smooth and seamless as possible. So what I found worked best for me was to get it close and then move over to my hand sanding sled and use my hand sanding rig with a flat backer and to draw it across, not this way, but to turn my sanding rig 45 degrees to it and to sand like this. That way it kept my rig flat across the wood and the resin at the same time. If I did it this way, then I'm still pushing the bump as in the transition. But by turning my sanding rig at an angle like this, I could support half of the rig on the wood as the same time it was on the resin. And that was what it took for me to be able to get a perfect transition. And on the knife that I made, I had facets all the way around the knife that were flats. And I'm going to show you some really close-up pictures of how it turned out. It was really rockin' amazing. Thank you, Bradley at Strange Materials, for donating this block right here. This is an amazing block of wood. What I think was the coolest part about this was this is rough cut. So when I got it, you can't really see what it's going to look like in there. So as I finished the knife and I brought the grits higher and higher up, I was able to start peering into the wood and the resin mixture to see what was inside, and that was really, really cool. It was almost like finding lost treasures in there. So that was really exciting. A lot of these hybrids come to you like this, where one side is already finished so that you can see what it's going to look like after you put it on your knife. And that's cool, but this was even better. Not knowing and sanding into it, that was pretty spectacular. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about was the finishing procedure for doing the hybrid. The procedure that I use for wood is completely different than the procedure that I use to finish resin. To finish wood, I like to sand to a medium high grit. 500 grit is usually as high as I go on softwoods. When I go to my hardwoods like ironwood and things like that, I would grind or I would sand even higher up into the 1,000-1,200 grit because the ironwood I just buff. This I plan on taking to about 500 grit, and then I like to put a penetrating oil on it like tung oil or teak oil, something like that, to get into the pores of the wood and really bring out the figure in the wood. This material isn't going to take oil at all. In fact, there's no benefit to putting oil on this in any way, shape, or form. This material, you need to sand out to extremely high grits, 12, 1,500, even higher. Some people go 2,000. Sand this out and then use some sort of cutting agent, like a buffing compound of some sort that has cut in it to do your final buff. I tried to sand this out and take it to the buffer. I was very careful. In fact, I was scared to use my actual knife because since I did have those flat facets and I maintained those crisp edges through the entire process, I didn't want to wash those crisp edges out. So instead of that, I took this piece over to the buffer and I wanted to see what it would do. So I sanded this out to my 1,200 grit and then I took it to the buffer. And what I found was the buffer made this cloudy. It didn't give me the desired effect that I wanted, even with the white compound, a really light compound, even just a clean cloth buff. It made the surface cloudy, and I did not like that. So what I ended up doing after some trial and error playing with resins was I take it up to 1,200 grit, and then I use mothers or flits. That stuff is made to polish chrome, aluminum, all kinds of different stuff. When I put the mothers on here and buffed it with a rag, it was instantaneously crystal clear, and that's what I wanted. So the finishing process that I did here, I sanded my guard first because the guard's the hardest material. So I sanded the guard without sanding the wood. So I focused on the guard, And then I moved into the transition between the guard and the wood because I didn't want it to wash out. Same thing here, how this could wash out because this is softer, the wood is softer than the guard. So I got the guard where I wanted it to be, and then I sanded my transition into the wood. I sanded this to 500 grit right here. The whole thing I sanded to 500 grit to bring it flush. I focused on the wood portion first, and after this was pretty much sanded and shaped, then I moved into the back section of the knife, especially with these little facets on the top of the knife, just to make sure that I kept everything nice and crisp. After this was pushed all the way out to 500 grit, I moved up to 800 grit and then all the way out to 1200 grit. Now the 800 and 1200, I just sanded the back of the knife where the resin was, and then I feathered that 8 and 1200 up into the wood, you know, because you're not really gonna sand too much off of this burr with 8 and 1200. All you're doing is just smearing the grain around. So at that point, I sanded this to 8 and 1200 and just kind of feathered my sanding into the wood so you can't tell that there was two different scratch patterns. And after that was done, I flipped the knife on end and I cut in all my flat facets on the pommel. I didn't do those until after this whole knife was completed. Then I cut in my flat facets and I hand sanded those facets all the way out to 1200. And then, after that, I took and buffed this with mothers. So this came crystal clear. I took some acetone and I cleaned my wood so the mothers and everything was off the wood, and then I put some teak oil on the wood to make the grain pop on the wood. After that, it's done. This thing is beautiful and I can't wait to show it to you guys. If you have questions, please hit me up in the comments. And guess what? I've got some other really neat videos that I'm going to put right here for you guys to go ahead and go check out, because those videos are going to definitely help you out on your knife making game.